Have an opinion about it?
Yes, no, maybe.
Okay, so I learned that the first industrial revolution was important to Europe because it did help them increase their economy, but at the same time it wasn't that easy when they were actually inside of it, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's very true. Okay, so we can say that industrial revolutions are great things when we're removed from them. When you're living in them, it's not so exciting. Okay, that's a very good observation. What else? What else did you notice?
I never knew it was categorized as like two kind of different revolutions.
Yes, we have two different industrial revolutions, and that's important for you to grasp, okay? Because obviously, the time period we're looking at right now for the United States is this first part, 1760 to 1850. And then you're going to have kind of this lull, in part because in the United States, of course, this is when we come into the Civil War. In Europe, you're going to have, really, this is where kind of socialism bubbles up. You've got, this is where some of those small skirmishes happen that are in this long century of peace, really, where you don't have major European conflicts, but you've got these little bitty eruptions. So around the 1850s, if I have any fans of Les Miserables, this is kind of when that happens in France. Germany has some, it's kind of unifies. You've got kind of a Franco-Prussian War that happens. So there's some little small skirmishes, okay? So we've got a few years where there's not a whole lot of industrial revolution going on. Then when the Civil War's over, and Europe kind of recovers from these little conflicts, we have a second wave of that. So, and like for the regular and honors kids, and for the spring semester for us, we'll be looking at that second period. Okay, so it's important to kind of see that there's two different times. Okay, because sometimes, and this will happen a lot when people do research or something, or especially if you go do random Googling because, I don't know what this is. Be sure they're distinctive periods, and yeah, people can pull stuff out of the wrong period, and that makes the whole thing wrong. So it's important to note that. What else did you observe? Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting how he was talking about how height can be a factor when it comes to if you have good living conditions.
Okay. And so what did they pull? What were they? What was the gist of that?
They said there was a decrease in height, but and then they're saying how if you did less labor and stuff, your height you would probably be taller. It would show that you're more nourished and stuff.
Okay. All right. So what can we extrapolate from that about this first industrial period? What do you think?
I mean, it showed a decrease in height during this time, so you could probably infer that a lot of people started working in the factories and more manual labor with the new machines, and then a lot of it also probably the increased people in the cities probably caused the lack of nourishment and food resources.
Exactly. So, and part of what it was saying as well is, and it says right here on this first page, we know that the Industrial Revolution made Europe rich. It does make people rich. And there's even a part in there where it talks about the importance of real wages, how after 1840, real wages, that means the money you can actually use to buy stuff, improves quite a bit. So I think that it's important that you recognize that there is that difference of perspective. Yes, the Industrial Revolution creates money, but it creates money for people up at the top of the social economic hierarchy. The people underneath, right, that are doing the work live a very different life. Okay, and so it gets kind of confusing, right? Because one of the things I want you to see is that there's a whole lot else going on here. It can get very easy to view, particularly U.S. history, from this kind of top-down, let's see what the big overview is. And what the overview is increased wealth, increased middle class, lots of trade, lots of factories, lots of expansion, and it looks great, great, great. Okay? But there's also another perspective that's from the bottom up. And that perspective looks a whole lot different. Okay? And so kind of our overview is going to look mostly from the top down. But don't confuse that as saying, oh, well, clearly everything was perfect back then, because it's not. Now, obviously, this article is talking about standards in Europe, okay? But the Industrial Revolution is directly tied to the revolution that happens in the United States. And it's important that you recognize that, here in the 21st century, we talk a lot about globalization. Globalization starts back here, okay? Globalization is when you have countries that are interconnected by trade and by foreign policy and things like that. So these issues are starting in the 19th century. Now, obviously, globalization, either then or now, is a tricky thing. It's not easy and it's complicated. And one of the issues that they have in the 19th century is this is incredibly new. The advantage we have in the 21st century is we can look back and study this. We know what this looks like, okay? Unfortunately, we don't do that often enough when we're trying to make policy decisions or foreign policy decisions. That's not to say that you can predict everything by studying the past. But you know from dealing with people in general, you know who to choose for a group project based on the way people have performed in the past, right? So that helps you decide, I don't ever want to work with that person again because, maybe they'll change, but most likely their past behavior is a predictor of what they'll do in the future. And guys, that's the same is true for countries, the same is true for economic trends. That doesn't mean it's 100%, but we can go back and look, and this should help us understand globalization in the 21st century. So this is why this stuff matters. This is why understanding it and how it all works together is important. That's why a magazine like The Economist is going to spend a little bit of time looking at economic history. Because you know what? Americans have stopped getting taller. For years, we've been getting taller and bigger and taller and bigger. And over the last 10 years, our height has stopped. What does that mean, right? What is that saying about our standard of living? What is that saying about our prosperity? Okay, we know that we have a wealth gap in this country, right? If you are following politics, you know that the different tax policies out there's lots of analysis about which group's going to pay more taxes, which group's going to pay less taxes, all that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, we know that there is a huge gap between what we would call the upper middle class and the wealthy, people that are making, a couple $100,000, families that are making a couple $100,000 a year or more, and people that are making less. That gap is widening. What does that mean? Okay, and I think when you look at these industrial revolutions, you get some insight into that, as well as the observation that the way it looks after the fact is very different from the way it looks during. Because when you're in the middle of it, it feels like a hot mess. Now, when you get out of it, when you're 50 years down the road, you look back and you say, oh, well, clearly, But it's always easy to look backwards at it, and understand how things went together. So that's why I kind of wanted to bring that out, because I think that it helps you have a little bit of a context as we go into looking at these factors of the market economy. So the market economy. So we've wrapped up last class talking about the War of 1812 and how the War of 1812 really kind of solidified an American identity. It finally put to rest those lingering kind of, British kind of connections in the American colonies that people had, whether it's the Federalists, being destroyed by the Hartford Convention, or whether it's the British finally, taking down the forts around the Great Lakes area, or whether it's the American Indians really not having any more European allies. So now it's pretty much just the Americans on this part of the continent. And so that dilemma is over. Okay, and in the process of doing that, Americans have really solidified who they are as a people, what they're all about. We saw that a little bit after the American Revolution. This idea that hard work pays off, that aristocracy of merit, right? That new American society where you had the idea of the Republican motherhood, that women taught their sons. They didn't need to vote because they expressed their republicanism through the men in their family. And you have, I can work my way up. And we certainly have lots of examples of that. From Alexander Hamilton, to Andrew Jackson. So there's lots of men that kind of work their way up through society, which was a trend that tended to happen in the British colonies anyways, okay? But now that the U.S. is independent, it's even more so. So we have this new American identity, and it's really powerful. We really have this strong patriotic sense after the War of 1812. In addition, now, and if you remember me talking about the impact of the blockade, that really kind of gave American manufacturing that for a long time had struggled to compete with British goods. And we saw this trend happen during the Revolution, when they were, prior to the Revolution and during, when we weren't getting as many British goods and American manufacturers were starting to kind of ramp up. But understand that they really went from almost nothing to all of a sudden within 50 years, having a significant place in this new industrial economy. And that's a pretty rapid development in a lot of ways. And it's directly tied to, number one, the fact we stopped trading with Britain during the Revolution. And then number two, the blockade stops trade with Britain. And that gave our American manufacturing kind of some growing space where there wasn't a lot of competition. And that is a factor that goes into business development, okay? And when we talk about the progressives that the regular and honors kids just finished talking about, and we talk about monopolies and trusts and the idea that are there good ones or bad ones and which ones do we go after, which ones do we not go after, that's part of what we're talking about. Sometimes businesses need kind of a niche for a little while so they can fully develop their product. Think in terms of the Samsung phone that they just pulled off the market, right? One of the reasons the Samsung phone had a fatal flaw in it is Samsung was directly competing with Apple. They rushed development on a phone that then malfunctioned so badly they had to completely remove it from the marketplace. And the result of that is that now the new Google phone has an opportunity that it would have struggled to get prior to Samsung's mess up. So this stuff has huge ramifications across the board, okay? So that's how we end up with this American market economy. And it helps that the political system is not quite as chaotic, thanks to the Federalists being kind of crazy and talking about secession, okay? There's only a couple of exceptions where Americans tolerate people talking about leaving the country. The Civil War was one of them. And then the other one is probably you have these groups that have emerged kind of in the last 20 years that periodically talk about secession. And that seems to be tolerated a little bit more now. And I just don't get why. It just blows my mind. And because typically Americans don't tolerate that. You are an American, suck it up. This is part of how the system is, right? If you don't like it, then you work within the system to change it. And that's really what America's been about the majority of the time, okay? So we become all about this national identity, and Western expansion is huge. We saw that with the Louisiana Purchase. Now that we've resolved these Indian conflicts in the West, now that we're not having to worry about Britain kind of picking on us, we can give our full attention to this territory that was purchased by the Louisiana Purchase. And that's really the name of the game, okay? You had Jackson really going after Florida, so that's going to be a big deal. So we're over in this period, and there's some nuances to that I'm kind of glossing over. Jackson goes down to Florida, picks a fight. Actually, Congress threatens to censure him because he's acting basically on his own. But eventually we resolve that and kind of we get Florida, so we control the whole Gulf Coast. So you've got lots of expansion happening in a lot of different ways. But that's it in a nutshell. And it's all about getting land and territory. And part of that is because of the market economy in Europe, this industrial revolution. There's a demand for American raw materials. just as much, if not more so, than there was in the 1600s. Okay? So the same things that help create the American colonies to begin with are going to be the things that help create Western expansion for Americans. And so that's something you need to kind of keep in mind. So people are going out west, trying to get land, trying to get these raw materials. Cotton is a part of it, but it's also about just engaging in farming, having your own stake. Remember, part of the idea that's emerged with this new national identity is that we all own a piece of the country. We all have our little section of land. It's the same, I have a house and a picket fence and 2 kids and a dog, and we still have the same myth, so to speak, now, where that kind of being bought in to the system is kind of the pinnacle of Americanism. So that's still going to be the case. And it's all based on this owning that property, having that farm, having that business, having something that you can say is your own. And so this is going to be very much wrapped into who we are as Americans. And this is going to be one of the issues with the factory system. Okay? We kind of see that now, actually. If you look at the number of people that rent instead of owning their home, of course that ebbs and flows based with, financing and so, trying to, housing bubbles and that kind of thing. But it's still the same kind of gist, right? I mean, how many people rent? You've got these gentrified areas in downtown Dallas or, New York or whatever, and this is your millennials and your middle class families that want to live in the city now. They don't want to live in the suburbs. So we might be either redefining, and of course that's another question, is our new economy redefining what it means to be American? Which is an interesting question too. Now back then, it's all about owning that land. And so that's going to be a real problem. The government is used during this period. You've got this this sweet spot, really, from the end of the War of 1812, when the arguments about the bank and all that kind of stuff really are not so important, until you start to get to the 1820s, okay? And the bank is really a big part of the development. Everyone's excited about encouraging manufacturing. Everyone's excited about encouraging transportation. We're moving west. We need ways to get stuff back and forth, okay? So roads, canals, rivers, all that kind of stuff become hugely important. And the idea that the federal government's going to help fund that is also important. Now, eventually that argument's going to get more difficult as states start saying, why do I want to pay for a road or a canal that's not going to benefit my state directly? We still have kind of that state identity that rears its ugly head, just like we had with the colonies. That does not go away just because we've now slapped United States of America on it all. Okay? So the states are still arguing, why should I care about what happens in Pennsylvania? I'm Georgia, right? My concerns are completely different than theirs. I don't care what benefits them, as opposed to seeing us as an entire country. And this is something that we still deal with, okay? So understand that some things don't ever change with the American identity. So that becomes very big. And again, the single party kind of simplifies this process because you don't have quite so much tension between the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans. There's a real focus on kind of compromise and working through issues. Now, it helps that part of it is that the problems are pretty straightforward just yet, okay? Notice this doesn't really last real long. It doesn't even last 10 years. It really only lasted the presidency of James Monroe. And really, by the time you get to the end of Monroe's presidency, it's not working so well. So this doesn't last very long. But I find it very ironic, actually, and this is an observation that I hadn't really made until this election cycle. But, one of the critiques of the 2016 election has been, the two parties are just identical, and why don't we have better choices, and it's basically voting for the same person, and, all this kind of stuff. Well, the interesting thing here is the era of good feelings is that single party unity. The idea that we're all Americans. We have, we're not voting based on party. We're voting based on ideas and on persons and character and who they are. Okay? So that party identity that people, that I hear, that when I follow Twitter or on Facebook or whatever, or in news articles, right? When they talk about the idea of party identity and people voting with their party or fretting over the course of their party. Understand that that's part of how the system is. This kind of idea of compromise, of voting as an American, is not probably, it is what Jefferson and Madison intended when they created the Democrat-Republicans. They create the Democrat-Republicans out of their fear that the Federalists are going too far away from kind of that essential nature of Americans. And so I think it's interesting that how little people understand the history of the party system and how it's meant to work. That doesn't mean there's not room for improvement, or that 2016 is the way it's supposed to be, because that's not it at all. But it does mean that you need to consider that there's a whole lot of history going on behind this that I think is, really kind of, when you hear pundits or whatever, news articles say stuff about, sometimes they don't even know their history themselves. Just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Monroe makes a really good cabinet, again, balancing lots of different interests. He's got John Quincy Adams from the Northeast. He's going to have John C. Calhoun from the South. He'll bring in Henry Clay from the West. You've got lots of different regions being represented. And that's the whole idea behind the era of good feelings. And Monroe manages to be the sweet spot, okay, where you have people with different agendas, different goals, different interests, get together, and for about 8 years manage to make some decisions that profoundly shape the future of the country, make huge differences. You won't see this again really until you get to the Great Depression and the New Deal. And you'll have another period where kind of the circumstances are such that, everyone's kind of, even if you have slightly different ideas about things, you kind of get together on the same page. So it does happen, okay? That is part of really how the system is meant to work at its finest. Foreign negotiations, another aspect of this, since we're going to talk about Western expansion a whole lot. And I mentioned this at the end of the last lecture. Rush-Bagot Treaty settles kind of that northern boundary with Britain. That was actually a little more touch and go than I'm making it sound, but we've settled that. We almost went back to war with Britain over that. Adams-Onis Treaty, thanks to Andrew Jackson kind of going nuts and thinking, yeah, I'm going to go fight Indians and Spanish in Florida without any authorization whatsoever, which gives you a preview into Andrew Jackson's personality. And they managed to settle that with the Adams-Onis Treaty that basically gives us Florida. So Mexico and South America, because of Napoleon, because he really kind of redrew the lines in Europe, Spain, France, those countries are much weaker than they were before. And they're not going to focus on South America and on Mexico anymore. So Mexico's able to get its independence during this period. A number of South American countries are able to push for independence. What you really see is that Britain, France, all these European countries, Belgium, for instance, they shift all of their focus to Africa. Africa and Asia, that's where they stay camped out. They decide they don't want to mess with the Western Hemisphere anymore, that it's too difficult to manage. And so this is where you're going to see the Monroe Doctrine come in. And part of that is that the Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe essentially says, okay, Europe, you leave Western Hemisphere countries alone. You don't mess with South America. If they want independence, you let them go. And if you try to interfere in countries in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is going to have something to say about that. Now, here's the side note to that. Britain's all okay with that. Remember, Britain doesn't have any more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. They don't have anything to lose by the Monroe Doctrine and everything to gain by having their crazy American cousin over here telling Spain and France and everybody else, you better step off because you don't want to mess with us. Because the first thing that will happen is Britain will work with the United States, okay? So you could almost argue that the Monroe Doctrine is the basis for a long history of Britain and the United States working together in foreign policy, okay? That's where it really starts. Once we finally decided that we're going to be friends, and we weren't going to keep trying to be in a relationship with each other, it becomes a much more powerful friendship, okay? And Britain's all okay with that. Now, typically, most of Europe is too. Now, Spain will continue to hold on to a few little colonies. Again, we'll revisit that in 1898. But for the time being, really, a lot of these Western Hemisphere countries start to gain independence. And so the U.S. is going to have some influence over there. This is why Mexico is going to entice Americans into Texas, because Mexico is a brand new country. They don't have the resources to protect their main Mexico from the Comanches and all the other Indian groups. Okay, so one of the things they're hoping is that they can entice Americans into Texas. They can be fodder for the Indian groups. They can get killed, not Mexicans, right? Which is a kind of an interesting take on the narrative that you're often told in Texas history, right? You know, Americans were so brave. Well, they were brave. I mean, I'm not going to take that away from them. It was incredibly brave to come live in Texas with the Comanches, because they were a lesser known, dare I say, empire, although I think that's a stretch of the word. They had pretty solid control of the Southwest, up through Texas, all the way up into Garland, actually. So they controlled a huge swath of territory. And that, when I say control, that doesn't mean that they had boundary restrictions and all that kind of stuff. You could move in and build a farm and be there for a couple of years before the Comanches showed up and said, what are you doing? You know. But for the Americans, remember, if you're not using it, then you must not want it, right? Oh, hey, that's mine. And so, yeah, you get lots of Americans coming into Texas, and Mexico's okay with that for a long, long time, until, of course, the slavery thing comes up, which we'll get to in a couple weeks. So we've got lots of recognition of new countries. We've got lots of global markets. And again, Europe is very busy other places. My husband was reading to me a factoid about, I don't know how many of you know, like Belgium controlled what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, okay? Made tons, little bitty tiny Belgium, okay? So when we talk about World War I and we talk about how Germany sweeps through Belgium to get to France, like little bitty tiny Belgium, controlled the Congo, made millions and millions of dollars exploiting in the most brutal way the people of the Congo. It's really a horrific story. So my husband's reading me this factoid about the conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And like if you were to, like when I say that Europe exploits Africa, it's profound. Like if you ever start doing any comparisons about the standard of living in like the Democratic Republic of Congo or some of these other places, now in 2016, and compare that with these European countries, you see the impact of this period on Europe and on Asia. And so again, you know, there's a whole history behind some of the current global problems that we have, and it really kind of makes it much more complicated. In fact, I suggested maybe Congo should sue Belgium. I don't know. Talk about reparations. Anyways. So the Missouri Compromise. So we're moving west, right? We've got new territories, right? We've got people moving to these areas, whether it's Missouri or whatever. They want to create a state. And the Ordinance of 1787 created this process by which you get people, you become a territory, you organize, you create a constitution, you get accepted by Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the big question here is whether or not slavery is going to be allowed to expand. So let's think back to what we've talked about with slavery before. We know that slavery the international trade was outlawed in 1808. We know that up north, slavery was declining, right? There wasn't as much need for it. They never relied on it the way the South did anyways, okay? And they figured out that free labor was much more motivated by making money than anything else. So they relied on that. Okay, so slavery is going away up north. And the concern that the North has in particular, but also some of the western territories, some of the places like in Ohio, their concern is that plantation owners, if they have a bunch of slaves, are going to have an unfair advantage. Because if they can get the loan to buy the slaves, they can work the slaves as much as they want with no concern about paying them wages or anything like that. I mean, all they have to do is maintain a basic level of care to keep them alive so they don't lose their initial investment. As long as they've done that, they're going to be okay. So there's a lot of concern about how can we compete fairly. if we're in a system of an aristocracy of merit where people work their way up the ladder, then how can a slave system encourage that? How can people have hope to be a Republican society if all you have to do is go buy people to work your farm, right? I mean, how does that work within our new system? So there's lots of dilemmas going on here, all right? And I think it's important that you understand that because one of the things we'll be reading in the next week or so will be kind of the defense arguments, why slavery was a good thing, okay? And it's important for you to realize that there were a lot of people that didn't think it was. There were people in the South that don't think it was. So just kind of know that this is a big debate. And the concern, and we saw this back in the creation of the Constitution, slave states that relied on slave labor, were very, very concerned about not having enough power to protect their interests. So from the very inception of the country, there's kind of this, this elephant in the room, if you will, that slavery was a problem, right? That slave owners needed slaves to maintain their position, and yet, right, it doesn't work with the political system. And that people that don't rely on slave ownership want to do away with it, but there's this concern about political power and economic power. And you need the southern states because of their cash crop economy, their commercialized agriculture, which at first was tobacco, then sugar, then cotton, okay? So this process of commercialized agriculture is incredibly important to creating wealth within the United States, and everybody knows it. So this is where that dilemma comes in. So money in politics is nothing new, and slavery is an extension of money in politics. So you see that Missouri wants to come in as a slave state. They have slaves. They want to endorse slavery. Everybody knows they're going to bring the slave interests into Congress. And the states that don't like that have a lot of concern. Is this going to tilt the system, tilt the country towards slavery? We have a philosophical problem with this. Is this going to economically disadvantage us because now you've got commercialized agricultural interests instead of manufacturing interests shaping policy? And remember, in a globalized system, you have foreign policy in a whole new way. Questions about tariffs, questions about trade, that while we were arguing with Britain over impressment, didn't seem quite as important. But now it's very important because now we're relying on this globalization to create wealth. So you've got lots of frustration there. And some of this is coming from small farmers as well. Small farmers are thinking, how can I begin to compete with a plantation owner that has 20 slaves? Right? He multiplies his workforce by that much, and I've got me and my 2 sons. How am I going to compete with that? So the Western territories are a little bit nervous about this too. And again, this has nothing to do, not that it has nothing to do. For a lot of people, it has nothing to do with it's not right, it's morally questionable. For most people, it has to do with this isn't fair, right? This is an unfair advantage, this is unfair political power, this is unfair economic power. You do have elements that are beginning to emerge that say, this doesn't fit within our ideals, this is not Christian, all this kind of stuff. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the reform movements from this period. Because this economic situation, right, where you have this wealth gap, where you have competition, is going to create opportunities for people to do lots of soul searching about who they are, what is the meaning of life, is the meaning of life only about making money, is it only about moving west, what do I do if I don't have the same amount of property as somebody else? Does this give me meaning in this new society? Okay, lots of introspection will come from this period, and that will lead to lots of reform movements. So Henry Clay from Kentucky will come in. He essentially says, you know what, we'll compromise. This is the famous Missouri Compromise, 1920. Many of you should remember this, the 3630 line. Creates Maine. Maine for a long time had been part of Massachusetts, even though it's like separate, right? But Massachusetts had held on to it. And of course, Maine had developed its own identity. So it's kind of like North and South Carolina, where everyone's like, yeah, Maine needs to be its own thing, And so they split Maine off. It's going to be a free state, no slavery there. Missouri is going to be a slave state, but Missouri will be the northernmost slave state. Okay, they're going to draw this line, and they're basically going to tell everybody, because at this point, Missouri is the main state that's been settled. So if you move west, understand if you go above this line, you should not expect to have slave labor, and if you want slave labor, you need to settle below this line. So again, this factors into the settlement of Texas, right? This is why people are going to be like, yeah, I can't move up north. So when Mexico says, yeah, come to Texas, and they figure out they can grow cotton in East Texas, that's why they do that, okay? Because they can't move above that line and have slavery. Now, most people don't like it, right? Most Southerners especially. They say that gives Congress too much power. Congress shouldn't be able to regulate things like that. Except that the whole point of this era of good feelings is really kind of the assertion of federal power over the states. So you clearly, as a whole, see the federal government strengthening itself. But this is kind of one of those events that's kind of simmering underneath as we start moving towards 1860, right? But this compromise will hold for quite some time, okay? You're talking about 30 years worth of really kind of holding the country together, resolving issues about slavery, kind of keeping the balance of power so that the United States can focus on other things. So it's an important compromise because it does allow us to do other stuff, but it's also important because this is the foundation of the problem. Because as Abraham Lincoln famously said, we can't be half slave, half free. We must be all one or all the other. Because it's a problem, right? And it will continue to be a problem. So that's where the Missouri Compromise comes from. And you need to kind of understand its role coming into 1820. This is a map that kind of shows you what it looks like. You've got this area close to slavery, this area open to slavery. That kind of gives you an idea about how all of this looks. And again, sectionalism. You're going to see that up north, up here, Maine, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, even into Ohio, areas around the Great Lakes, you're going to have lots of factories, lots of towns. You're going to start moving into these western territories of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Those are going to be small farms. The small farmers are going to start moving out here. This is where the Nebraska territory is and that kind of stuff. And then these are all going to be your slave states, your big farms, your big plantations, cotton and sugar, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, some in Tennessee. Once you start to get to Tennessee and North Carolina, the plantations start to get smaller. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but they're just not the big, massive plantations that we see down here. So Northup's story, of course, is right here in Louisiana, where these big plantations, these cash crop things are going on. So just kind of keep that in mind. And, of course, note that Maryland, where D.C. is, was a slave state. But, again, you're not talking about the sugar plantations the way we're reading about them in Northup. So that's where kind of that difference in the labor system, the gang and task system comes in. Market economy. So the Bank of the United States is reauthorized by Congress. Remember, that was something that had to be set up by Congress. That was part of the debate with Jefferson and Madison. So it gets reauthorized pretty handily. There's no real drama with that. And so this is called the Second Bank of the United States, or as I sometimes refer to it, the second bus. And then you've got manufacturing and factory become the main money makers, okay? That's going to be where people, especially in the Northeast, are making their cash. Now, down south, it's going to focus on that cash crop. At first, it's going to be sugar, then it's going to be increasingly cotton, the more the Industrial Revolution takes off in Europe. So just kind of keep that in mind. You have the other groups here are your subsistence farmers, or kind of your small grain farmers, your family farms, or your factory workers. And that's where the majority of your people are going to be, okay? Most of your people don't have the resources to own factories. Most of your people don't have the resources to own a cash crop plantation. You will start to see, as the factory system emerges, more middle-class people, in the sense that you need professional managers, you need teachers, you need doctors, you need lawyers, those kinds of upper middle people. That's where that's going to emerge from. But it emerges because of this solidification of manufacturing as a primary economic system. The internal improvements. By internal improvements, I mean things like trains, canals, roads, all that kind of stuff. You have the emergence of Robert Fulton's steamboat and steam power. That's going to be profound in developing this transportation, especially as we're moving west and people have to get their products from the west to the east and the finished goods from the east to the west. So that will become very, very important. And everybody's pretty much on board with we need to invest in this. Very much so. Although, you hear some of the same arguments now when people argue about roads and building roads. Well, why should I worry about paying for a road? Why should I worry about investing in, bridge infrastructure repair? Why does that matter to me? And yet it does matter, because if our bridge system is collapsing, even if it's in a different state, it's going to affect us here in Texas, right? Why would high-speed rail between Texas and Houston be an incredible investment? Because think how much business happens between, not Texas, Dallas and Houston. How much business happens between Dallas and Houston? So these are things that profoundly shape a national economy, not just a state economy. Protective tariffs, that's going to be a hot button issue, especially as we get into Andrew Jackson's presidency. Now, we all understand what tariffs are, right? Taxes on imported goods, okay? Now, do you understand what tariffs are meant to do? Say it. Yes, keep business in the U.S. In other words, let's limit the competition, okay? We don't want these foreign products coming over and selling cheaper. We don't want Toyota being able to take business away from Ford, okay? That's what tariffs do, okay? Do you know what the unintended consequence of tariffs are? What is the unintended consequence of tariffs? If we raise tariffs on goods coming from Japan, how is Japan going to feel about that? It's going to restrict their markets, isn't it? So what do we think they're going to do to us? That's right. They'll raise tariffs, taxes on the things we try to send to them. Now, if you're in a situation where you have what they want and they can't get for themselves, that's great, okay? Then that means you get to call the shots. But, okay, and this is, there's so much history connected to this. This is why we strive for oil independence, okay? This is why Japan in World War II becomes very territorially aggressive, because they don't want to have to rely on the United States anymore, okay? Because when you can control that, you can force people to accept things they don't want to accept. Now, so that's kind of the balance of power. Now, here's the issue, right? If we have high tariffs to protect manufacturing, but we also have lots of agriculture. We've got cash crop farming that's growing cotton, some of which is intended for Europe. What do you think the ramifications of tariffs in the 1820s will be? We've raised tariffs on goods from Britain. We have cotton we want to sell to Britain. What will happen? Yes, they'll make it more expensive to buy our cotton, right? And if they make it more expensive to buy our cotton, it's harder to sell our cotton, isn't it? All right, so stick that in the back of your head. This issue over tariffs and its ramification for agriculture, that it reduces markets for agricultural products, even as it protects the domestic market for manufacturing, will not go away until we get the income tax to replace the tariff system, okay? And then now we argue about the income tax system, all right? So you need to fundamentally know that particular aspect of tariffs, because you can write that down, you can engrave it on your brain. That is the case until income tax replaces it. So that being said, different regions are interconnected at this point. The American factory system is benefiting from the closeness of cotton, the closeness of raw materials. And that's part of why the transportation is so important, okay? And then this whole question about who should fund what. Now, I said that we have the emergence of federalism. One of the big ideas from this period, and you can kind of read through these court cases, and it's pretty safe to say, like I, of course, haven't even made the mid-final, haven't even thought about the final, but I usually don't ask questions specific to the court cases. What I want you to know is the overall message, and I put it in bold just to simplify the process for you. Basically, the Supreme Court, in several key decisions during this era of good feelings, comes down squarely on the side of the federal government. The federal government is more important than the states. Okay? States, check yourselves. Okay? We know that you think you're the most important and that your economy is the most important and that your issues are the most important, but there's a national economy at stake, and that's what matters. And a national government needs to manage the national economy. And businesses need to know that they have protections anywhere in the United States. Because without those protections in the United States, we're at risk. Okay? Businesses might not want to invest here. So that's kind of the overall message here, is that you have a much stronger federal government. And this is kind of where that power that we saw with Marbury v. Madison really starts to flex itself. Because now, the Supreme Court's not saying we can force you to do anything. They're just saying, sorry states, this is the way the law is. This is how the law should be interpreted. End of discussion. Okay? And that establishes the precedent that is then applied. Okay? So, unless Congress were to change something, that's the way it is. Okay? Now understand that we continue to play with this, right? I mean, we've actually been in a period over the last 20 years or so where states have really gained a lot more power for themselves. Okay? And to some extent, you've seen the Supreme Court actually support that, not really undoing these things. But that's where the Supreme Court becomes very important, because they can shape these ideas, maybe not forever, but certainly for several generations. And that's what will happen with the Marshall Court. So just be sure you you have a general understanding of the strengthening of the court system. Modes of transportation. This shows you kind of the early railroad. Again, steam power is a big part of this. The canal system, you read about that in Northup's book, right? Very much a big deal. The Cumberland Road is very much a big deal. Lots of growth in the railroads during this time period. This is a picture of kind of the Erie Canal, of them constructing that, what that's supposed to look like. This is another system of canals that are built, all to connect the rivers. Okay, we have control of the Mississippi River. There's a number of rivers that flow from the west to the east. These canals are meant to make it much easier for for states to get stuff together. Ferries in New York. We don't have steel yet. Okay, steel doesn't come on the scene until after the Civil War. So when we get to the second industrial revolution, we'll talk about the development of steel. And that will have a profound impact on cities like New York and Chicago. At this juncture, though, you still have growing cities. Just because we don't have steel doesn't mean the cities aren't getting bigger. New York's becoming very huge at this point. There's several cities, Philadelphia, for instance. But someplace like New York is relying on the ferry system. So there's lots of ferries going on. The Underground Railroad, I'm sure when you're doing that, you're going to read about ferries, because that's a part of it too. Because that's how you cross some of these rivers. And so that's, this is very important. Major inventions. Inventions are always a part of business expansion. Always, 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 always. And we'll see this when we get to the period after the Civil War with the development of electricity and the telegraph and the telephone and all that kind of stuff. Well, in the first industrial revolution, what you're going to see, cotton gin, of course, and we've already talked about the fact that that was actually intended to reduce the need for slaves, right? We don't need as many slaves to produce cotton until, of course, we now have all this land that we need to clear and cotton becomes a profitable cash crop, and there's this huge demand in Europe. And so, the intent of the cotton gin in 1793 is to get rid of this troublesome system. But in fact, the system has a life of its own. Okay. He also Eli Whitney creates interchangeable parts. These become a really big deal, particularly with gun manufacturing. If you have a lot of people moving out west, dealing with challenging situations, being able to have some guns is a good thing. And now, if your gun breaks, you just go get a part to replace it, right? And then he starts using that for a lot of different factory systems, right? Not just guns. So factories now can rely on interchangeable parts. So this again creates efficiency and ease in trying to create these large-scale production systems. The reapers, the plows, these become very important in moving out west. So you want to be sure you understand that. We wouldn't have, if you didn't have reapers and plows, you wouldn't be able to develop the farms out in the Missouri area or in the Nebraska territory. So Europe is basically, not Europe, the Americans are going to copy the factory system. So we had kind of this emerging factory system coming from 1812. But the Industrial Revolution is kicking off in Europe. And as it's kicking off in Europe, Americans are going to start to realize they're falling behind. And they start advertising in Europe to get people to come over. And so they're going to have Samuel Slater's going to come over, and he's going to set up the first factory system with Slater's Mill. And again, steam power, water power, those things are incredibly important. The water wheel is very important to it. Before you have the factory system, you have a journeyman apprentice system. One of your readings is about kind of the artisan system and how that worked, so that'll give you a little more detail about how that, if you're thinking in terms of Republican virtue, that I have a stake in this country, right, that what I do is meaningful, the artisan system is going to give you that. I make something, and it's worth something, and here you go, right? Except, right, as the factory system comes in and pushes them out, what does that mean? And so this is going to be a big kind of deal. You're also going to see that farming in the north never develops the cash crop, so this is what's going to give the southern states kind of their power in this system, is that they're able to produce the mass quantities of raw materials that farms around New York or around Philadelphia can't do. Because if you remember back to the colonial period, they were never engaged in that kind of farming. It was always diversified. It was always family-based. It was, always semi-subsistence. At best, you might have a prosperous farmer who was able to live comfortably and lease out farms so he didn't have to manage it day to day. At best in those areas. And that's going to be a part of the regionalism that we see developing in this market economy. So, the Lowell mills. So we go to, all right, we need to create efficiency. We've got interchangeable parts. We've got all these raw materials. We can make so much stuff, right? So how can we make stuff faster and better? And the first idea that they bring over from Europe is the idea of integrating production under one roof. Rather than have this artisan putting out system where people farm out work to different individuals or whatever, let's get it all in one place. After all, we've got interchangeable parts now. We have steam power. We have water power. So we can power these big machines. We have the interchangeable parts to fix the big machines. All we need are people to stand there and push buttons or turn knobs or whatever specifically it was, okay? So the tasks then become much more mundane, much more specific, much less skilled, okay? So instead of having to be an artisan at shoemaking or an artisan as a silversmith, you are now just a person working in a factory, turning a knob, hitting a hammer, tightening a belt, whatever it is that you're doing, okay, whatever kind of factory it is. Now, initially, the factories are predominantly textile factories, but that will explode pretty quickly. And a lot of that's due to the cotton production, thanks to the cotton gin, so forth and so on. So you see how that lets a genie out of the bottle. Also creates uniformity. Uniformity in construction. So that now, instead of saying, well, don't go to that shoemaker he does terrible work. You want to go to this guy. Now you've got people that can measure quality. Let me see the shoe you just pulled off the line. Is that worth it? Is that good? This is where you get standardized sizes and all that kind of stuff. Okay? So instead of having things fit to the individual, right, now you've got people, mass producing these items. That's going to drive the price of the goods down. It's going to make them cheaper, right? So initially, the southern states liked this because, oh, hey, we're able to buy these goods really cheap. Until, of course, they're continuing to make more stuff, more cotton or whatever, that, and than what they can produce or than what there's a market for. You're going to have this emergence of the middle class as overseers, administrators, and initially, people in the factory system appreciated that the factory was a questionable Republican value. That if you don't have a stake in what you produce, if you don't have a sense of ownership, then why are you going to care about the country? Why do you care about who you vote for? Aren't you going to be easily swayed? And remember, we're reducing property requirements for voting at the same time as this is happening. Now, is that a correlation? Probably, right? Because you don't want a bunch of unhappy factory workers that say, I don't have a say in my government. So you start scaling down how much property you have to have in order to vote to make, especially your middle class kind of administrators, overseers, able to have a stake in the system, right? Because they're going to own a little bit of property. They're not going to own a factory. But they're, hardworking people. They own a little bit, so they should be able to vote, right? Yeah, maybe we don't want the factory workers to vote just yet, but, So this whole question about how much stake do you really have in the economy and the government if all you're doing is turning a knob, okay? And so that's going to be a real pressing question. So the initial answer to this is, we'll get women. After all, women don't vote. Their value in the Republican society is to teach the young men. So they don't need to worry about that. So what we'll do is we'll essentially let young girls, young unmarried women, come work in factories. They can earn up a little bit of money. This is especially powerful in the Northeast, okay, where you don't have these massive plantations, where there's lots of semi-subsistence farming, because the fathers can't get together enough money for a strong dowry. And girls, this is back in the days when you had dowries, okay? And so this was a way for a girl to go earn her own dowry. I'll go work in the factory for a couple of years, save up money, and I'll have my own dowry to get married, okay? And start my new married life on a good footing. Or if they have, sick parents or something, I can help take care of my family. It's all very much about nurturing, centered on the family, very much kind of tangled in with Republican motherhood in this process. And so everyone's kind of okay with women doing this at first. Yes, this is an acceptable workforce. They have boarding houses. They've got like matrons and people that oversee their moral development and all that kind of stuff. And so this is really seen as a key answer. The other interesting development with the factory system is if you're going to build a factory and have a machine and have a boarding house and hire workers, you need investment money. So we see businesses going from single owner, I own my business, to I have to have partners, 2, 3, 4 partners. Because the needs, the financial needs and the financial resources of factories to sustain itself over many years require people with deep pockets. And it's very rare for one person to have pockets that deep, especially involved in manufacturing. So you have the emergence of kind of these partnerships. Now, what's unique about this is that at this point, your business owners are typically still relatively tied to the factory, in the sense that they often at least live in the same state, if not the same city or town, okay? So you don't have these very distant and far removed owners like we'll see after the Civil War when you have the emergence of stocks. And, people all over the country own stocks in a company and they don't have any stake. Like when the company lays people off, they don't have to face them, Whereas in this system, right, your partners are going to have some level of accountability. Of course, that's still contingent on their own character, because there's some that really don't care, They don't care about the conditions of their workers, but there's some that do. So just kind of point out that this is an extension of kind of, because of the demand for investment capital, capital, which is another business element for my future, MBAs out there. Lowell girls, these initial women that work in the factories, we kind of like lump them all together as Lowell girls. They didn't all work in the Lowell mills, but that's kind of the catch-all term historians use. Regimentation, bells, schedules. You get up at this time, you eat lunch at this time, you leave work at this time, you go to bed at this time. This is the beginning of that kind of regimented schedule. Now, this will get on steroids after the Civil War, but it starts when you have a factory system. Because when you're going to house all the operations under one roof, you've got to have a schedule. The whole point of this is efficiency in production, right? Efficiency, mass production. And if you're going to do that, you've got to have a schedule. Okay, schedules are efficient. And there's a lot of paternalism, right? A lot of control over their daily lives. Now, for many of these girls, that's not going to be that different than what they face at home. And so there's not fundamentally anything majorly wrong with that. Most girls are kind of like okay with it until the paternalism starts to become very negative. And that will happen. Because anytime you have success at something, more people are going to show up. And the more people that show up, the more likely you are to have some bad apples. And you're going to start to have some bad factories, some bad overseers, some bad owners that take advantage of girls, that abuse girls, that don't give them the breaks they need, that, sexually abuse them, that kind of thing. Okay, so there's lots of stories about that as well. Okay, you'll be seeing some of those. And again, it kind of gets some, change of scenery. So some girls really like this, especially at first. There's a number of young girls that really advocate for this system as kind of giving them a chance to see a different side of the world from their home, because the worlds are very, very small back then. And these factory systems often had their own little newsletters, and they encouraged girls to write, and they would have their own study groups. And so at first it's this really great system until, of course, it starts to make lots of money. And then, like I said, more people start to show up, and you start to see things change. And we get longer hours and worse conditions, and basically they start getting stricter and stricter and stricter, and you can see, if you talk, if you have to take a bathroom break, if you're sick, they start fining you. And that starts to remove your incentive, right? You start to feel trapped. It starts to get harder and harder to save up that dowry or send money back to mom and dad. And you're going to start to get resentful. And then you're going to have more competition, which means that you've got more people fighting for jobs, which means wages are going to go down, and owners are going to be less inclined to be nice and understanding and let you have a fun little newsletter or a study group or something like that. And then you're going to start to have Irish immigrants show up. Okay, Irish potato famine happens about this time. The Irish leave Ireland in droves, and they show up in America with nothing, and they're ready to do whatever work they have to. And so they start hiring Irish men because, they're not Americans, so we don't have to worry about that whole Republican virtue thing because they're Irish, okay? And the discrimination against the Irish was incredibly strong until you get to the Civil War, okay? They were really, you had blacks and you had Irish, okay, really close together. So people didn't consider them the same as Americans, so it was okay to work Irishmen in a factory. And the Irishmen, you didn't have to have a boarding house. You didn't have to worry about their moral development, and there were plenty of them. You could fire them if they didn't behave, if they didn't show up to work on time. So this is going to begin to change the circumstances for these young working women. And these women are going to eventually they're actually going to unionize first. And I think I gave you that article, or maybe I didn't. Women actually unionize first to kind of push back against the owners and demand better wages and better conditions and better hours and all that kind of stuff. But very quickly, right, it's just not going to matter. There's too many Irish immigrants. There's too many factories. There's too much competition for jobs, and it's just going to be irrelevant. And there's lots of pushback against unions, even at this stage, right? The United States doesn't like unions. Unions are seen as a threat to the factory owner's property. So that's kind of where that comes in. And so this is going to have the creation of a working class, okay? Which was what they were trying to prevent in the first place, this kind of low-class group there. And so limited social mobility because it's very hard if you're getting paid very little wages, and this is why I had you read that article at the beginning, to kind of reflect on how difficult at that time it was for these people to move up the social ladder. So the whole idea of aristocracy of merit that was so very important to this new American society is eliminated in the factory system, okay? And so this is going to be a prevailing question that people have to deal with. And sobriety, the rise of the temperance movement. So these are some of the concepts you'll want to think about when you think about your discussion board. Not even so much the discussion board exactly, but this is kind of part of the big picture, I guess, is the way I want to say this. Does everyone have a role in the factory system? Is the role of the overseer the same as the role as the factory worker? What about the role of the owner? How does that relationship work together? How does advancement work? How does hard work and merit pay off in this system? How do women fit into this system? How are they exploited? How are they not exploited? And is this factory work what we would call virtuous in the sense of Jefferson and Madison believing that the virtuous American farmer being this Republican idea? And how democratic is it? If you don't own property, if you don't own land, you don't own your own tools, you rent a room, and you show up to the factory and you work and you get paid wages. If you don't own property, are you a part of a democracy, right? And can you just pack up and move, right? Some of these people have trouble moving. These owners can put out a word, don't hire this person, they're a troublemaker, right? You can work yourself to death. You know, what if you have a family and you can't escape the cycle of poverty? Do you have freedom in this system? You know, it's easy to say, oh, just move out west and start a farm, except if you can't get ahead to feed your family enough food, then how are you ever going to be able to pack up and move out west, right? So there's a lot of prevailing questions there. Very quickly, because I'm about to run out of time. Southern interests, textile markets, again, tariffs a big concern. Southern interests want to protect slavery, especially political slavery power. Northern interests want to basically take care of manufacturing, the manufacturing issues. They also want a stable money supply. So for them, they like having specie, gold currency. Now, in the southern states, or actually more specifically the western states, where you have all this buying of land and western expansion, they're going to like a paper money, right? Because paper money is easier to get, right? It's easier to get a loan with paper money than it is with gold specie. So we've got an emerging conflict happening there. And of course, for the western interests, it's all about statehood, congressional power, and they want to be treated as equals. And I think that's important for you to see that, especially as we start looking at Andrew Jackson. So kind of familiarize yourself with the general interests of these different sections. If you have a question, you can ask me. Market economy controls and organizes the flow of goods. You're going to have a lot more urbanization. Urbanization means the growth of cities because factories have to be close to cities for transportation needs. And they're going to typically be close to rivers and places where they can easily ship their goods. This is going to tend to encourage immigration. We saw with the Irish potato famine, but there's still going to be other immigration from Germany, from England, from France, from Scotland, all these areas that were frustrated after the Napoleonic Wars, or frustrated with the first Industrial Revolution in Europe. They're going to come to the United States looking for better conditions. Specialization in the sense that you're going to have a huge group of unskilled workers, and then you're going to have a group of skilled workers that are extremely specialized. And you're going to have specialized tools that remove the need for specialized workers. Okay, that's the other piece of it too. So that's going to come into play. Women will kind of have a different role. Materialism, because we're making so many products. The wealth gap is going to be a huge issue between the different social classes. And then, of course, panic, recession, depression is going to be a huge deal. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the Panic of 1819. Okay, so right is kind of in the midpoint of Monroe's presidency. This new market economy, you had lots of production of cotton because the Industrial Revolution was kicking off and there was demand for cotton. So cotton prices are really high. Southerners are making lots of money. There's lots of speculation in Western territories, all that kind of stuff. And it's going to crash the economy, okay? And that's because we have a bubble, a price bubble on the cotton in the land. And of course, England will ultimately end up going to India, right? That's one of the reasons that Britain invests so heavily in India, because they want the cotton, because they're tired of kind of being forced to deal with the southern United States all the time and the prices that they demand. And you're basically going to have the same Second Bank of the United States is going to call in a bunch of loans from the states saying you need to pay up, okay? And that's going to tighten the economy. And this is going to create issues across the board. You're going to have a frozen economy. You're going to have unemployment. And it's going to hurt all territories. It's not going to be just one territory over the other. And so this has a larger, not only with England and India, you're going to see that England's going to respond with some tariffs on American farm products. So some of the hatred that the southern states and the western states will have for the Bank of the United States come from this panic right here. Because Europe is having more options to make its own stuff. Finally, blame goes everywhere, particularly the government, particularly the Bank of the United States, and particularly tariffs. And this is where you start to see the Westerners especially, and even the Southerners, emphasize popular influence in government. That the government, the banking interests, the manufacturing interests are controlling the government. Politicians are being bought. Doesn't this sound familiar? That they're being bought and controlled by interests that are not what the rest of the people want. And so we need to have the rest of those people come in and they'll make government right again. Okay? And that's kind of the gist of what's going to happen as we move into the election of 1824 and the rise of Andrew Jackson. So kind of look back over those slides, make sure you kind of understand that. I'll look at the document I was going to go over and see if I want to record anything about that or if I want to just kind of let you guys look at it and see if it makes sense. I don't know. I'll think about it. But I think that's it. So, 1 minute to spare. Okay. Mental note, I spent too much time on the article. So let me get this stopped. All right, come here.